Hallo allemaal, welkom bij dit programma-onderdeel van Pride Amsterdam in de Kunsthal. Of Pride Amsterdam, Pride Rotterdam moet ik zeggen. Oh mijn god, wat zeg ik? Pride Rotterdam, hier in de Kunsthal in Rotterdam. Mijn naam is Valentijn de Hingh, ik ben schrijver bij de Correspondent over identiteit. En af en toe sta ik ook achter de draaitafels. En vandaag ben ik uitgenodigd om jullie door het programma-onderdeel heen te leiden. We gaan zo meteen kijken naar een video, Living as Poetry. En de video bestaat uit een gesprek tussen Olave Ndwanye, dat is een jurist, activist, politica, schrijfster. Ze identificeert zichzelf als non-binaire trans femme. En zij gaat in gesprek met Alok Vaid-Menon, jullie wel bekend waarschijnlijk. Gender non-conforming, schrijfster, dichter, performance artist. En zij gaan het hebben over een enorm scala aan onderwerpen, waaronder zelfzorg, het loslaten van verwachtingen, het geweld van hokjes en labels en daarnaast ook over pride. Zowel het belang als ook de problemen die soms ontstaan bij groot georganiseerde pride events. Dus pride, the good and the bad. We kijken zo meteen naar de video en dan daarna ga ik daarover in gesprek met Beyong Veldkamp. Zij is transactiviste en werkt met haar organisatie Trans United aan het vergroten van de zichtbaarheid van biculturele transgender personen. En hopelijk ga ik daarna ook met jullie over de video in gesprek. Want er zit ontzettend veel interessants in de video en ik denk dat jullie er waarschijnlijk superveel vragen of opmerkingen of gedachten over zullen hebben. Dus laten we snel beginnen, laten we naar de video kijken. Misschien goed om ook al even te zeggen, na de video hebben we even een korte pauze. Ga dan niet weg, want het gesprek begint kort daarna, maar dat heeft even te maken met iets van de techniek. Ja, ik wens jullie heel veel plezier bij de video tussen Alok Vaid-Menon en Olave. En daarna zie ik jullie terug voor het gesprek. Dank jullie wel.
Hi, how are you?
I am well. I am actually in Rotterdam with some lovely, lovely friends, and we're about to have some Surinamese food that I haven't had in a long, long time. So I'm in a very good place right now.
Amazing.
Yeah.
How does it feel?
How are you?
Here in Rotterdam, in particular, what does it feel to be a part of Rotterdam Pride?
Yeah, it's difficult. I think also a little bit, if I may be honest, just between the two of us, also quite frustrating and aggravating as well. There is a long history of the Rotterdam Pride and certain communities, marginalized communities, whether they're racialized or trans or less privileged in terms of access and whatnot. There's been a lot of things that have gone really, really wrong, and things I've been part of, things that other people that I care about have been the victims of in dealing with Rotterdam Pride and some of its ideological and political choices over the last, what is it, 6, 7 years now? No, 5. Like let's say 5 to 6 years. And so it's a bit surreal to be talking in front of on behalf, well, in assignment of Rotterdam Pride.
Mm-hmm.
But at the same time, I'm also feeling rather, I don't know, I always get very happy if I get an opportunity to talk to you. We've done a few talks over the last few years, and it's always been incredibly rewarding and enriching in my life to talk to you. So it's a bit, bittersweet. There's some sweet, and the sweet is you mostly.
I feel like that kind of murkiness around Pride represents how so many brown and black trans folks feel across the world around Pride, because we're in this kind of perverse moment where even though people like Sylvia Rivera, Marsha P. Johnson, Miss Major were the kind of front activists to create the world of Pride, here we are 51 plus years after the fact, where Black and brown trans feminine people still continue to be an afterthought. And so every time that I'm engaging with Pride, I try to remind myself that we're reclaiming what was and will always be rightfully ours. And that there is, of course, the dominant narration of Pride who gets access to the energy, the resources, the attention. But I think that we actually have a counter history that we're part of. So I was excited to have this conversation with you, you know, actually paying allegiance to that tradition and history, which is always lurked beneath. I think that when we tell stories, there's a story that circulates and the story that lives beneath it. And so much of what trans of color resistance for me is actually paying homage to that repressed narrative. And I hope that in this conversation, we can do just that.
Well, one thing, speaking of that, one thing I find, I know you're talking about this doing honor to that and celebrating that and remembering that and reclaiming that. But I think what is really unique about also this period of time, this year, these last couple of months, is that we're seeing that Black and brown, queer and trans folks have never stopped being at the forefront of struggle against oppression. Like America, the Black Lives Matter movement and the uprising, like queer and trans folks, like Black and brown, are heavily involved in that as well. That's part of that, our legacy as well, that we can definitely, we don't have to go all the way back to Sylvia Rivera and Marsha P. Johnson. It's still going on right now. When you see people like Angela Davis, you know, a Black queer woman. When you see people like Major, a Black trans woman, who are still very much, you know, at the most radical, most fundamental, holding the most potential ideas about prison abolitionism, ideas about intersectional feminism, about restorative justice, like. Black and queer and trans, brown trans people have continued to be part of that, you know, and I think that I like to think that when we celebrate Pride, we are definitely celebrating a certain continuum of struggle within and for Black and brown, queer and trans bodies. Definitely, I think it's such a special time to think about that as well, to hold that and celebrate that and honor that. You know, whether or not the dominant and narrative accepts that or understands that or acknowledges that or celebrates that.
You know, a lot of what I've been trying to do, especially during quarantine, the situation of the pandemic is quite developed here in the US, is I've been trying to use this space that I've had with myself to decenter the kind of dominant imagination, because I realize that so many of us don't know who we are outside of what we've been told we should be. So many of us don't have a self-image outside of how other people see us. And I started to realize I don't know how to see my own fucking self. Like, I know how to see myself through goggles that were given to me. And I've had to do that kind of deep confrontational work that I haven't had to do for a long time. And what I've started to actually realize is part of that work of decentering the dominant narrative also looks like saying, let's redefine what resistance is. And I see you doing this. And so I wanted to have this conversation with you. I'm redefining resistance to actually be about our living, the way that we exist, how you're sleeping, where you're sleeping, what you're eating, your day-to-day sort of living. And that for me is the substance of the political. And when we look at that legacy and ongoing tradition of trans of color resistance and Black trans resistance, what I learned from that is the ethic of care, that we weren't just spending our times screaming at like white cis heteropatriarchy. We were also finding ways to love and care for one another because we understood that after the march, there's still transness. And I don't think a lot of people get that. So I wanted to hear from you about how do you understand like the daily work, the daily resistance work of being?
Bit of my origin story in activism. When I first got involved in anything remotely sort of radical or subversive or as part of any of the resistance traditions you're talking about and also that you're suggesting, the first steps into that was me being, I was involuntarily committed in a psychiatric hospital. I was at my wit's end, and because, you know, and part of it had a lot to do with the fact that I had no other answers for understanding why I was failing to fit into this cis heteronormative, patriarchal, capitalist, imperialist, neoliberal sort of, economies of thought, of behavior, of being, of existing. I had no other answers other than those provided by those ideologies of oppression, right, and of extraction. It was only when I was, committed that I came into contact with, Black feminists, Black feminist women also, who really kind of started helping me and giving me access to certain things and understandings that I had, but I didn't believe it, that I didn't respect, that I didn't value, that I thought were wrong, and because they came from me, from my understanding and observing what was happening around me, I kept on thinking I must be wrong, the system must be right. And I met these Black feminist women who told me the knowledge that you hold as to your oppression, but also your liberty, as to your struggle, as to your joy, and so on. Like, they taught me to believe in that, to really center that, and to build from that. And I was in a place where quite selfishly needed healing, and I needed community. And I found in being, an activist, the kind of opportunities or the kind of people I was encountering, they brought me that healing and that I needed. They brought me answers, and they gave me a sense of like, I belong to a way of practice, of resistance, and so on. So quite honestly, I think that if activism doesn't bring me healing in any kind of contact that I'm in, organizing or speaking or theorizing, if I don't find healing in that, I don't partake in it. That means also when I find myself in organizing communities or in certain dynamics of power and of hypercriticism within the community, where I find myself as scared of getting it wrong, as scared of being wrong, as when I was sort of living under, internalizing all these ideologies of oppression. For me, that doesn't feel like that's activism, right? Like, I really think we need to even think about whether, if we're not inherently doing something else different than what we have been taught, that was the ideologies that we've internalized, then I really wonder whether we're doing activism at all. So, the ideologies of old for me meant that I needed to prioritize, quote unquote, intellectualism, intelligence. I had to prioritize efficiency, productivity. I had to prioritize being, like, fitting in within the norms and speaking the right language, and so on. And if we in our communities are not really providing alternatives, then are we really doing anything different? If we're not thinking about the ways in which norms, in which, speaking the right signal, like virtue signaling and so on, that's problematic, and we're creating outlets and avenues for other people to participate without proving, through like language use, or if we're not creating communities where care, joy, pleasure, healing is centered, then we keep on talking about the right analysis, the right, the amount of demos you've been at and whatnot. I don't know if we're really doing something differently.
I worry that we're in a moment right now, yes, absolutely, where we only have worth in so much as we can perform our trauma. And that's just so dangerous, because then I got to a place in my life where I didn't know myself outside of violation. I didn't have vocabulary for my transness, my queerness, outside of being attacked. And so even in the ways that I was writing and thinking in my most intimate ways, it was still foregrounding the people attacking me, which felt like an extension of the attack. And so what I've really had to do is realize that the most political and transformative work I've ever done in my life is silent, is like me just literally being with myself and feeling. And there's no way to like make a cute Instagram caption about that, because it's not cute. There's no way to like brag about that. But what I've realized in doing that kind of intentional healing, trauma-focused work is that actually for me, the marker of revolutionary activism is militant compassion. And we dismiss compassion and love as forms
for ourselves and each other, is mostly. We're not just talking, right? You're not just talking about militant compassion to the other, the external, but also for ourselves. Yeah.
Yeah.
Sorry.
I've been told over and over again that that's just me being naive, or me just being an idealistic. And I'm like, no, that's me being a feminist.
I kind of have a lot of empathy for how difficult it is to do this beyond the self, but to do it for your whole community and with your whole community. And I feel like it requires of us to really engage each other also like that as communities, and whether it is mutually for our bodies, for our minds, for our souls, for our futures, our resources, for our welfare and whatnot. I think it's really difficult because I think we don't have the tools so much. We're first of all surviving a lot, so we're paying a lot of attention to the threats and the risks and the betrayals, like also within the queer community, those who betray us, and while we focus on that a lot, we're also just to survive. But I think we also need to find the time to learn the tools of community care, of community and mutual and collective healing, of being, creating safe havens and sanctuaries, of being that for each other as well. I think the kind of that's something, perhaps systems of thought that we don't really spend a lot of time talking about, how to unpack those and how to uncheck them, how to liberate ourselves from individualism. I think sometimes it's easier to really do that trauma work just for myself, and I am at loss sometimes of tools on how to engage my community in those processes as well. Is that
being gender nonconforming, being someone who lives with chronic pain and disability? I have been liberated from individualism through those things. Because they require me to constantly ask for help, because there are days that I'm just in too much pain. There are days in which I am afraid to go outside. There are days in which the online harassment is too much, and so I just need to talk to someone on the phone. And if I were to have to cope with all of that by myself, I don't think I would be alive. And so I've been able to see how my survival is dependent on me having access to community. So one of the things I started to do during quarantine is I assemble a group of some of my best friends who are predominantly Black and brown trans people. And I just have these Zooms for about 2 hours every month where we just process shit together about like, hey, I'm thinking about doing this. Should I do this? Hey, I don't really know this. And we're trying to decenter this kind of all-knowing individualism, which for many of us, we realize we've been primed towards self-sabotage. Like when I make decisions for myself only, but then I don't want to give decision-making power to the state, justice for Britney Spears. So how do we actually hold a kind of mutuality and multiplicity in living our lives? Means we have to build trust with one another. I had a lot of comrades, but I didn't have a lot of friends. And the distinction for that is, who cares about me when I'm inconvenient? Who cares about me when I'm unpopular? Who cares about me when I'm lonely? Who cares about me when I'm depressed? And that's where I think transformation comes from, is when we're able to actually like, who's ready to do that care work?
I wish there were ways in which we could, sort of incentivize each other as well to be vulnerable, instead of, being afraid of being problematic, or being afraid of not being edgy or radical enough or something, and I'm just sitting here thinking, how can we incentivize one another to be vulnerable, to be not knowing, to be unsure, to be scared, and to bring that in the spaces in which we organize, perhaps, but also in which we simply exist with one another, right? Because I think I find also more and more that so many of the spaces in which I'm meeting other, quote unquote, comrades are organizing spaces or organized spaces. The facilitators, is the event, the panel, the action group meeting, and it's constantly is in these working spaces. And that was something for me when I was, like for COVID-19, the pandemic, the lockdowns and so on, really reinforced for me. And I became aware of how lonely I actually was, even though I was surrounded by so many people, because I speak often at places, I organize demonstrations here and there and so on. And then when all of that was taken out of the equation, I realized that I was alone a lot, that I was essentially lonely, because I didn't have any other spaces in which I was coming together with other queer, brown, and Black trans people.
Bringing up the pandemic in this way, I've had to really reconsider a lot because, you know, so much of my life was I was a live performer and speaker, and that's just not going to be possible in the US for a long time. So I've had to really ask that work of being like, what am I actually? Because I can't do what gives me the most joy. And I think that's where I started to redefine myself as a healer, and that poetry and performance, you know, that's one medium of healing. But what it means for me to be a healer is to actually recognize that lurking beneath the world of the political and the world of language is like a kind of vulnerability that is always bubbling at the surface, but terrified because it's been punished and persecuted. And to be a healer is to actually say, I'm not going to punish and persecute you for your the poetry of your being. That poetry for me is not just a method, it's a form of life. And to live a poetic life is to understand that the people who are the loudest often are in the halo of their phones at night before they go to sleep, consumed by self-hatred. That's not
I feel like you're reading me now. That's a read.
Not a read.
Okay, sure, I'm hearing you. Sometimes care isn't all comfortable. Okay, I hear you.
That's not a contradiction. It's just what it means to be alive, you know? And so I started to realize, like, I can't take surface as the realm of truth because we're all navigating so much. And so then what I started to realize is if I begin from the premise that everyone is navigating like eons of trauma, so many things that they're maybe not even able to surface or visualize, the only thing that I can do is respond with openness, porosity, and radical acceptance. And I've started to do this work, and I don't want to say everyone needs to do this. I'm just speaking to myself, but I've started to do this work of meditating on love for the people who hate me.
Oh, wow.
That has been really hard. But now what I've found is like, I love these bitches because they don't know who they are and I know who I am. And that is so terrifying in this world, to encounter a truth where your opinion cannot shape or sculpt it because it is resolute in its amorphousness. And that's what it means to live a poetic life for me, is to find our resolution in our ambivalence. And so because my truth is I am because I don't know, that means that all of the hatred that's flung to me, it doesn't offend me, it doesn't touch me because I'm connected. And the way that I could connect with myself, I really resonated with what you're saying before, was because I had other people love me.
Again, see, this is I think what happens when you decenter the gaze. Like that focus on ourselves, that focus on our own potentialities is liberating in the sense. I think liberatory work is really about creating space to exist, to flow, to grow, to change, to I don't know, to be fully and open, to just really break down the barriers of all these things that we've been told, and the opportunities that were created only that were taken away from us to exist, to flourish, to thrive, to, you know, also just be complete. You know what I mean? And I think as long as we really focus on the gaze, on the sort of limitations that are put on us, whether it's in terms of resources, whether it's in terms of opportunities, whether it's in terms of who we can be or who we're thought to be, you know? And as long as when we focus on ourselves, I think that something happens that is extremely rich. I think we become also deeper, you know, and we come to witness one another and ourselves in ways that the white gaze and the sort of the oppressor could never, right? And I think as long as we're focused on there, we're sort of stuck in their own limitations of imagination, of who we can be and who we are. And when we let go of that and really focus on ourselves, I think you end up with these extremely powerful testimonies to things like healing, you know, generational, transgenerational trauma. That's an incredibly powerful testimony to what it means to not focus on the white gaze and whatnot. So I could go on about the different ways in which I think also, like, as a community in Rotterdam, what has happened at some point, people decided to just do their own thing, right? To just, you know, create spaces like Queer Rotterdam, to come together and organize for and by one another. And it is extremely powerful what has happened there. Like Rotterdam Pride organization, the sales, the more mainstream LGBT organizations could have never dreamt up of half of the things that you're seeing happening from Queer Rotterdam and Clow and whatnot. Like it's really, it's poetic. You know, like what you said, it's living poetically. That's what I think is amazing about what these young people, mostly young people, have really done when they said, you know what, we're not gonna ask, we're not gonna go negotiate, we're not gonna continue sort of needing them or asking for their permission or waiting till they free up resources. We're just gonna do it ourselves. And it's been amazing.
What worlds are open to us when we no longer have anything to prove? And when we divest from legitimacy as a criteria. We're so obsessed and fatigued by legitimacy. Like, are you really trans enough? Are you really political enough? Are you really conscious enough? And all of those are about taxonomies that come from racial science. Like racial, I've been reading so much like 17th, 18th, 19th century European scientists, and they were so obsessed with ranking bodies, founding the frameworks of race and gender and sex. And what I'm learning while I'm reading them is like, we're still doing that today, and we think it's different. We're always just trying to label. The violence of a label is you're taking your individual self-perception, which comes from your trauma landscape, and you're making that the summation of who fundamentally and ontologically someone else is. Yikes! When instead, what we should be doing is asking the question, not making the declaration. And so I think what my model of community is, are we willing to really dwell in the questions with one another? Are we willing to suspend finite answers? Are we willing to actually hold the inherent chaos of being alive, not as something that's unruly, but as something that is? And I think what healing work has allowed me to realize is like, growing up with so much trauma, I sought easy narratives to get clarity. Like, these are the good people, these are the bad people, I'm this, blah, blah, blah. But now I'm starting to realize I don't need to interpolate the universe into a narrative in order for the universe to exist. The power of the universe is that no matter how many narratives I throw at it, it's going to keep on being and vibing. And so rather than trying to claim sovereignty, I'm going to surrender. We've been, I think, describing how the various regimes of pride have been violent and complicit, without a doubt, and that can never be undermined or underwhelmed. That there's a history of dispossession of particularly Black trans women and Black trans femmes from the conversation and organizing and campaigning around Pride. And I think it's so special that you're a part of this, and I wanted to say thank you. But I also wanted to ask for your advice about future. We are 50 years out of Stonewall. What do you think the next 50 years could, I'm not going to say should, could hold? What is your dreaming?
What I'm hoping is that we spend more time, what you said, dwelling on ourselves and on each other's sort of questions, existential questions, and so on, and find in there the language to formulate a vision of where we want to be, really. I think, and I'm talking specifically about the Rotterdam, perhaps some of the Benelux and European context. I think this is very different from the American context right now. But I think for our context, there are so many, we are so reactive to what is thrown at us, to the violences we've become way too accustomed to. There is a particular, whether it's in the city of Rotterdam or in the European continent, there is a lot, like the extremism, the rise in fascism is really, really troublesome. We are under threat in so many different ways. And I think that to get out of it, to really sort of have a fighting chance, I think we really need to start to really focus and talk and create spaces where we can have very vulnerable conversations about where we need to be and how we will get there. I think we haven't really explored questions like alternative justice models to the retributive and punitive restorative justice models. We haven't really talked about things like prison abolitionism. We haven't really talked about the position of migrant and the undocumented people on the continent. We haven't really talked about the schisms and how we're going to heal those schisms that have come about, whether it's between, in a very painful way, how cis and trans people of color have they have these schisms happening because of religion, because of interest, because of patriarchy, schisms between queer and straight people in the Black and brown communities. To have a fighting chance, we're gonna have to learn as queer and trans Black and brown people, we're gonna have to bring the conversation to our cis brethren as well, There's just so much work that needs to be done. And I think it only starts if we can have very invested but vulnerable conversations with one another, and to create the spaces where we can have those conversations. That's perhaps for right now what I'm dreaming for us. I'm in despair, frankly speaking. I'm in despair, and I think that's perhaps a state of perception, of understanding, that I don't want to knock it. I think there's a lot of value and a lot to be learned from developing and nurturing a sense of despair. Things are about to get much worse. And I think that only if we are in despair can we really, really realize that we're going to need each other. I think despair doesn't throw one onto oneself. I think it throws us into each other's arms. And I think so far we've had hope on a very personal, ontological level. We've had hope. So therefore we have treated each other a little bit as disposable. Therefore we have treated each other a little bit extractively, exploitatively. I think we've treated a little bit each other as the enemy oftentimes. And I think some of it is because we've thought that it will all turn out okay, and it won't. We've gotta shift gears, think of each other very differently, and engage each other with a very different way of necessity, like you said earlier, of urgency, but also of desire to really be with one another, to really get to know each other, because it's gonna get bad. It's getting bad really quickly.
When we're talking about the rise of fascism in the US, it is so obvious. There are 500,000 people who have been displaced from the forest fires right now in Oregon, right? Yeah. So literally, we're seeing climate doom in action right now on the West Coast. And there was a story yesterday about how some right-wing people refused to evacuate from their burning towns because they were afraid that the leftists would come in and loot. And they wanted to protect their towns from these leftists. And I saw a lot of people online being like, these dumb people, blah, blah, blah. And I was just like, stop that. Let's really think about what's happening here. What's happening here is the product of a system that has taught people to fear the perceived threat of something that does not exist when there's an actual fire ravaging and killing them.
Yeah.
So how do I respond to that? Do I say, you're dumb? Or do I respond and say, I'm so sorry that you've been manipulated into not seeing that you're being burned, and I am sorry that you're burning in the flames. And that's the kind of orientation I want us to move to, is like, people are not just engaging in these things because they want supremacy, but the desire for their supremacy is because they don't know who they are. And once you know who you are, you don't need to prove to other people that you're the greatest, because you've accepted it for yourself. And that is the gift of disability, of transness, of racialization, of queerness, is that we have an opportunity to accept ourselves on our own terms and therefore reject the enfolding of supremacy, which is only a project of loneliness. And what happens if we realize that the people who are oppressing us are the people who are lonely, and they're oppressing us because our form of living and loving is so transformative that you would call me in the fire and say, the fire is coming, and I would believe you, and I would leave everything because I trusted you enough to know that you cared about my life. That's what community is. And the fire there is not a metaphor anymore, I think is what I'm hearing and what you're saying about the urgency.
It really is
not a metaphor.
No. Oh my God, again, powerful, powerful, powerful. Like I know for a fact, as someone who spent most of my life, I'm 36 now, and I think I spent almost 27, 28 of that. Well, I think 30 even. 30 of my 36 years, I really invested deeply into these, ideologies and these fears that were cultivated with these people that they couldn't actually leave and get evacuated. I really believed in them. I really internalized them. I really lived them. And I can tell you for a fact that this side of the coin is much better. It has so much more kindness, so much more softness, so much more pleasure as well, and so much more courage also as well. I think there is a courage that comes from living an authentic self, but like living the way that we do, the way as trans people, as queer people, as people of color who are resisting the system. There is a particular courage that comes with it that I wouldn't trade for anything.
Thank you so much, Olave. And I just want to thank you once again for just your incredible leadership in Rotterdam, in the Netherlands, in Belgium. I can't overestimate the impact that you've had on my life, on the life of so many people there in the region. And I know it's really difficult for you to receive this kind of praise.
I'm not listening. I don't know.
That's exactly why I'm doing it. Okay,
yeah.
Thanks so much.
Thank you so much.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Ja. Nou, dat was de video. Is dat geen applausje waard? Toch wel een beetje. Ja, prachtig gesprek, toch? Vinden jullie niet? Ja, prachtig. Oké, we gaan dus... ik ga zo meteen napraten over deze video met Beyong. Beyong, misschien wil jij alvast bij mij komen zitten. Maar we nemen heel even een korte pauze, want er moet even een switcheroo met de techniek gedaan worden. Dus over 5 minuutjes gaan we weer verder. Blijf vooral zitten, ga niet roken, ga niet plassen. Want anders mis je misschien wel het begin van ons mooie gesprek. Ja, kom maar alvast naar voren, Beyong.
Dankjewel. Goeiedag.
Ja, jeetje. Wat zei je? Ja, we schenken lekker ons water in. Dat gaan we doen. Dylan? Kan Beyong even... Yes, volgens mij kunnen we weer beginnen. Hi Beyong, jij zit nu naast mij, welkom. Yes. Wat leuk dat wij met elkaar over deze prachtige video Living as Poetry kunnen napraten met elkaar.
Zeker, leuk.
Superleuk. Eerste gedachte over de video, wat vond je ervan? Was er iets wat er voor jou uitsprong?
Ja, zeker. Ik vond heel veel erkenning, ook in de verhalen natuurlijk. En zijn ook dingen waar ik in mijn dagelijks leven mee worstel, zeg maar. Dus heel veel erkenning en ja, heel bijzonder om deze twee icons en rolmodellen te zien. En dat ze zo eerlijk zijn en open. Echt maar
Dat
geweldig.
zijn ze echt, hè?
Ja.
Kun je een voorbeeld noemen van wat je herkende of wat je mee hebt gemaakt?
Ehm, nou, het anders zijn, zeg maar, weet je. En met alles tegenover het normatieve eigenlijk. Met mijn gender, met mijn seksualiteit en met mijn race, zeg maar, ben ik op alle vlakken pas ik niet in een box, weet je. Dus, en ik heb ook geleerd wat ze zeggen van het healing, dat zeker, doordat ik heb 10 jaar, ik ben zowel activist als professional als vrijwilliger, zeg maar. En ook, ik leef in die wereld, ik ben zelf ook de doelgroep, om het zo te zeggen. En door veel mensen te leren kennen, vind je erkenning en daardoor anderen te helpen. Net als nu werk ik als maatschappelijk werker in Amsterdam bij Veilige Haven. En dat is zulk prachtig werk, want daar ben ik ook speciaal aangenomen vanuit mijn ervaringsdeskundigheid om jongere transgenders te begeleiden. En dat helpt mij ook weer in mijn proces verder, zeg maar.
Ik ken jou een beetje en ik heb jouw
Klopt.
activisme hier en daar mogen zien. En je doet echt
Klopt.
allerlei prachtige dingen. En ik weet, of ik zie ook als jij bijvoorbeeld in het openbaar spreekt, dan ben je heel open en dan vertel je eigenlijk ook over hele persoonlijke dingen. En
Klopt.
dat maakt je activisme heel goed, maar dat kost ook iets, dat vraagt ook iets van jou. Hoe ga je daarmee om?
Zeker, het is een wisselwerking, zeg maar. Wat ik ook zei, van doordat ik anderen help, heb ik al gezien dat je jezelf ook helpt. En doordat ik andere mensen ontmoet, weet je dat je niet alleen bent. En dat is voor mij, zeg maar, het doorgaan en niet opgeven, weet je. En ik heb ook een burn-out gehad 2 jaar terug, 2,5 jaar terug. Maar dat is ook logisch. Ik had zoveel leuke dingen. Ik deed zoveel leuke dingen ook. Allemaal geweldige dingen die ook voor anderen inspirerend waren. En dat gaf mij ook weer kracht. Ja, dat
Ja.
zeker.
Ja, want daar hebben Alok en Olave het natuurlijk ook met elkaar over het belang van zelfzorg. En als je een burn-out hebt, volgens mij is dat dan ineens super belangrijk op zo'n
Zeker.
moment. Hoe heb je dat voor jezelf, hoe heb je voor jezelf gezorgd in die periode? Ik stel hele persoonlijke vragen hoor, dus
Ja,
als je er
nee.
geen antwoord op
Nee,
wil geven, dan
nee.
mag dat ook.
Nee hoor, ik ben een open boek, dus wat dat betreft. Nee, ik heb gewoon terug naar de basis. En gewoon met gezond eten, dat soort dingen. Op tijd naar bed gaan, je rust nemen. Want het was een periode van mijn leven. Ik had mijn coming out als trans, om het zo te zeggen. Maar ik ging ook gelijkertijd als een professional werken bij COC Nederland. Dus er kwam zoveel en ik leerde gelijk veel. En op een gegeven moment was ik flauw gevallen toen. En ook in mijn privé, met mijn ex was het heftig, zeg maar, veel meegemaakt. En alles heeft toen zo'n tol geëist, zeg maar. En toen daarom ben ik in Zwolle gaan wonen, waar ik nu woon. En ook met therapieën om handvaten te krijgen om het leven weer te omarmen, zeg maar.
Wat goed.
Ja,
Wat
zeker.
goed. Je bent er sterker uitgekomen, of niet?
Absoluut, absoluut.
Ja, wat goed. Je zegt al inderdaad ook dat onderdeel van je activisme is ook het vinden van die gemeenschap, die community. Daar hebben Alok en Olave het natuurlijk ook over. Hoe belangrijk is het om samen te zijn met mensen die zijn zoals jij?
Heel belangrijk, heel belangrijk. Vooral ten eerste omdat je weet dat je niet alleen bent. En daarom ben ik ook zo trots op Trans United. Het is nu een stichting op Europees niveau waar mensen, zeg maar, hunzelf kunnen zijn of onder andere zorg krijgen omdat ze ongedocumenteerd zijn of wel aan hun hormonen komen. Weet je, dat zijn wel zaken waar wij transgenders mee te maken hebben in het dagelijks leven. En een transitie is niet 1, 2, 3. Het is heel zwaar en heel heftig. En ik weet als geen andere hoe sterk je bent als transpersoon om jezelf te durven zijn in deze wereld waarin we leven.
Ja.
Voorzichtig gezegd, hypocriete wereld. Weet je.
Nee, ja. Oh, hypocriete wereld?
Ja, in die
Hoe
zin-
bedoel je dat?
Nou, weet je, met allerlei dingen, ook binnen organisaties, zeggen mensen van ja, transgenders issue belangrijk en het moet op de schema. Maar je ziet het niet in subsidies die je krijgt bijvoorbeeld. Weet je, want wanneer je een voorstel schrijft, dan is het, oh ja, is belangrijk, maar we hebben geen potje. Terwijl we als geen anderen weten dat er altijd wel een potje is, maar ze moeten net willen. En in dat soort dingen bedoel ik hypocriet, weet je, dat we er nog lang niet zijn. En daarom ook het verhaal met Marsha P. Johnson. Toen ik die documentaire zag, dat ik het besef kreeg van... eigenlijk ben ik dezelfde strijd wat hun ook zeggen, weet je. En hoe lang nog, hoeveel zusters moeten er nog doodgaan en broeders voor onze vrijheid om te zijn wie we zijn.
Ja, Marsha P. Johnson werd ook genoemd in Living as Poetry. Kun je vertellen wie Marsha P. Johnson was, voor de mensen in de zaal die dat misschien nog niet weten?
Ja, dat was een van de voorvechters en daarom zitten we vandaag ook hier als onszelf en dat we deze vrijheid kunnen genieten. Het is een aanrader om te kijken, je kan het een tijdje op Netflix kijken. Maar het gaat over de eerste sekswerker trans, BIPOC, die eigenlijk de Pride is gestart en in New York toen met Sylvia Rivera. En vandaar dat we eigenlijk hier kunnen zitten en deze vrijheid genieten. En Pride is niet altijd een feestje. Het feestje is ook belangrijk, geloof me. Een drankje doen en stilstaan bij waar hun voor hebben gevochten. Maar het is ook mooi om te zien, en dat zei ik net ook al van, ook Rotterdam Pride. Ik heb Amsterdam Pride ook meegemaakt vaker. En er is ontwikkeling en je ziet ook inclusiviteit. En wat ik ook mooi vind aan Rotterdam Pride is dat het heel veel inhoud heeft, wat ook belangrijk is.
Ja, precies. Want die inhoud ontbreekt af en toe nog wel.
Ja, absoluut. Ja, zeker. En in Amsterdam is er ook veel inhoud, maar het is te veel op één hoop in 1 week, waardoor je soms niet van alles kan genieten. Of heel veel dingen onzichtbaar worden, terwijl het wel belangrijk is.
Het feestje overschaduwt eigenlijk het protest, wat er ook moet zijn.
Ja, klopt, waar het eigenlijk om gaat.
Ja, precies. Want daar wilde ik het sowieso ook met je over hebben, omdat ze het in de video ook hebben over hoe belangrijk Pride is, maar ook hoe problematisch Pride is op sommige momenten en in sommige steden, vanuit sommige organisaties. Voel jij je verbonden met Pride?
Jazeker, het is wel een moment in mijn leven. Het is mijn Koninginnedag. Ja, het is gewoon mijn dag waar ik mezelf kan zijn en je kan vieren. En ik zelf vind het heerlijk. En om mensen te zien, bijvoorbeeld op de Prade ook gewoon in hun string. Dat mensen de vrijheid genieten om gewoon hunzelf te kunnen zijn, weet je. En dat mag een dag, weet je. Want ja, de rest van het jaar moet je al jezelf steeds verdedigen, om het zo te zeggen. Of ja... Terwijl bijvoorbeeld, soms ben ik niet bezig met dat ik trans ben, maar door mijn omgeving word ik er dagelijks aan remind, weet je, van, you're different, om het zo te zeggen, weet je.
Ja. Maar waar Olave en Alok het natuurlijk ook over hadden, was dat Pride op sommige momenten ook gewelddadig kan zijn, of op sommige momenten mensen uitsluit, of niet ziet, of niet hoort. Heb jij dat ook wel eens ervaren of meegemaakt?
Ja, zeker, zeker. En weet je, het is op allerlei manieren. En daarom hebben we toen ooit ook de eerste transgenderboot, biculturele transgenderboot georganiseerd. Dat kwam ook vanuit die frustratie dat er geen inclusiviteit was. En ze zeggen het wel. Nogmaals, heel veel organisaties zeggen van LHBT en QI. Maar doen ze daadwerkelijk iets voor de doelgroep? Want uiteindelijk leidt de doelgroep eronder.
Ja, want Olave die heeft het er bijvoorbeeld over dat wat je in Rotterdam zag, is dat er na een aantal jaar waarbij de Pride-organisatie eigenlijk de geluiden vanuit sommige gemeenschappen binnen de LGBTQIA-gemeenschap had genegeerd, dat zich eigenlijk die groepen zich gingen afsplitsen en gewoon hun eigen dingen gingen organiseren. Dus bijvoorbeeld Queer Rotterdam en andere organisaties en groepen. Wat vind jij daarvan? Vind je dat we misschien als zo'n dominante organisatie niet luistert of niet inclusief is, dat we die dan los moeten laten en ons eigen ding moeten gaan doen? Of zeg je nee, we moeten juist eigenlijk proberen om die dominante organisatie mee te krijgen met ons verhaal?
Nou, ik denk het tweede, mee te krijgen, weet je, want je kan het niet alleen doen. En je kan niet voor het ene vechten en niet voor het ander, weet je. En we zijn er nog lang niet en we hebben elkaar gewoon nodig. En wat dat betreft, natuurlijk kan het en, weet je. Het hoeft elkaar niet uit te sluiten, maar we moeten elkaar tot op een zekere hoogte wel gaan vinden. Want ja, we vechten en streven allemaal om die vrijheid en jezelf kunnen zijn.
Ja, precies. Ik wilde het ook nog eventjes met jou hebben over die identiteitslabels en die hokjes. Want ook daarover komt eigenlijk een, weet je wel, Alok beschrijft heel mooi die ambiguïteit. Dus dat die identiteitslabels soms ook wringen, niet passen. Soms ook exclusief of gewelddadig kunnen zijn. Wat vind je daarvan? Zijn identiteitslabels en hokjes belangrijk? Of kunnen we er eigenlijk ook zonder?
Ik denk dat we er zonder kunnen, want vaak is het ook niet eens realistisch, weet je. En ik zie het met mensen om me heen die een vrijheid genieten. Ik ben een persoon die, als je bij me bent, je mag jezelf zijn, weet je. En be you vooral. En dan merk ik het gewoon aan hoe soms het relieving is ook voor mensen. Ik zie het ook bijvoorbeeld met cliënten van me waarmee ik werk. Gewoon dat je al transpersoon bent en een luisterend oor voor ze hebt. Wat het met de persoon doet en de ontlading. Gewoon de groei die je ook ziet. Want ja, van sommige mensen ben je een zus, een broer, een mama. Weet je, en daarom is het ook heel belangrijk, deze communities, ook het volgen en zo, weet je. Ik ben hier zelf niet zo in thuis, maar ik vind het prachtig, omdat er ook, door posts ben ik het ook beter gaan begrijpen, doordat ik posts ging kijken, dat ik zie, het is niet alleen het volgen, het is een hele gemeenschap, het is een hele familie, en they taking care of each other, en daar is waar het ook om gaat.
Ja, dus een label of een hokje kan ook heel krachtig zijn om je daarbij te horen voelen of onder te laten vallen.
Ja, het is ook iets persoonlijks uiteindelijk. Hè.
Ja, precies. Voordat wij hier de zaal binnenkwamen, hadden we het even over compassie. Toen we buiten een sigaretje stonden te roken samen. En in de video gaat het daar natuurlijk ook vrij veel over. Een soort radicale compassie voor jezelf en voor je medestanders, maar natuurlijk ook voor je tegenstanders. Ik vond dat een van de meest aangrijpende dingen in de video, hoe ze dat beschrijven. Vooral Olave op het laat. Of Alok, die vertelt over het mediteren op liefde voor je haters eigenlijk. Want ik vind dat soort dingen ook super moeilijk.
Ja, zeker. Ik ook. En het is...
Hoe ga je daarmee om?
Ja, niet altijd even goed. Heel eerlijk. Omdat de ene keer heb je meer kracht om met iemand in discussie te gaan en diegene te educaten. En het ligt ook aan de moment en de time en de person, hoe iemand je approach. Maar het is, wat hij zegt is wel de key. Gewoon met liefde benaderen. Ik denk dat dat het beste werkt, want mensen reageren vaak vanuit een onwetendheid. En dat kan soms agressie met zich meenemen. Of ja, we kennen genoeg cases waar het fout is gegaan en hoe het kan gaan. En het is vaak ook wat ik zie met geweld, dat het zelfhaat is ook.
Ja. Ja, en daar moet je ook medeleven voor kunnen opbrengen. Of hoe zie je dat?
Ja, helaas wel, weet je, want je kan niet violence met violence gaan bestrijden, want zo te zeggen, het wordt erger. En kijk, ik ben ook een type van, als ik iets zie en nu heb ik dan een auto 2 jaar, dus ik voel me wat veiliger en flexibeler. Maar ik herken dat ook, dat als ik over straat moest gaan, dat ik soms gewoon een empowerment talk met mezelf heb van, oké, B, je gaat met de trein, laat je niet afleiden. En weet je, vooral niet op idioten ingaan, want het kan zo verkeerd gaan. En als ik zie dat je wel een gesprek openstaat, kan ik ik ben met mensen in de tram een gesprek aangaan en zo, weet je. Dus wat dat betreft, ik ben er niet vies voor. Maar als ik zie dat je dom gaat doen, ja. Mijn oma heeft me zo opgevoed, als iemand een stoel pakt, pak jij een tafel. Dus weet je, ja.
Ja. Oh ja, precies. Een van de zinnen die mij heel erg bijbleef toen ik de video voor het eerst zag, want ik heb hem al gezien ter voorbereiding van deze talk, was The Gift of Transness. En ik vraag me af, ervaar jij being trans as a gift?
Zeker,
ja?
Zeker. Ik zou het niet anders willen. Het is zo leuk mezelf zijn. Dat klinkt misschien een beetje arrogant, maar het is niet arrogant bedoeld. Maar het is gewoon, als ik nu ergens binnenkom en mensen kijken, dan denk ik van, ben ik normaal? Weet je, omdat ik er nu zo aan ben gewend geraakt. En ik zit nu ook al bijna 10 jaar in mijn transitie. Ik weet wie ik ben. Je staat er veel sterker in. En dat is het fijne ook van door anderen te helpen, zeg maar, met die healing. Dat jij ook jezelf beter leert kennen. Maar in het begin was het echt niet zo. Ik ben soms momenten thuisgekomen dat ik gewoon jankte. Omdat je gewoon niet begreep dat iemand ja, zo op je kan reageren, weet je. En nogmaals, het hoort bij de mens, vooroordelen. Ik heb ook vooroordelen. Sterker nog, als ik iets op straat zie, moet je me eens horen soms, weet je, dat ik denk, hé, laat staan als mensen jou zien, hoe zullen ze dan op jou reageren? En dat was, vooral in het begin ging ik ook daar echt bewust aan de slag mee van, weet over jezelf. En, maar ik denk de beste methode is self-love en taking care of yourself.
Geldt dat ook voor, want jij identificeert je, of jij noemt jezelf vol trots een biculturele transvrouw. Ja. Geldt dat dan ook voor het biculturele stuk van jouw identiteit?
Zeker, want ik ben Surinaams-Nederlands, om het zo plat te zeggen, door de bocht. En dat is een privilege die ik kan genieten in deze, om het zo te zeggen. Want ja, daarom zeg ik ook trans of color. Het is gewoon, ja, in die term voel ik me het fijnst. En ja, het is ook iets persoonlijks. Dus op die manier, zeg maar.
Dus dat is echt wie jij bent, het past bij je.
Zeker, zeker.
Ja, wat goed. Laatste vraag voordat we naar het publiek gaan voor hun vragen en gedachten hierover. De vraag waarmee Alok en Olave afsluiten is, hoe kunnen we nu verder met Pride? Zeg maar, als we nadenken over Pride in de toekomst, de komende 50, 100, 150 jaar. Hoe zie jij dat dan voor je? Wat moet er veranderen? Wat moet er blijven?
Nou, het mag meer inhoud, zeg maar, en meer safe spaces. En ik denk ook, het moet niet een maand alleen zijn, het moet het hele jaar. Moeten er plekken zijn waar mensen hunzelf kunnen zijn en een safe haven hebben.
Ja, en wat is dan bijvoorbeeld die inhoud die je dan nu mist?
Nou, dit is behoorlijk al inhoudelijk, maar ik bedoel meer ook qua... waar het probleem ook omgaat van waar mensen tegenaan lopen. Zoals, weet je, ik zit in de hulpverlening. Er is nog echt veel te winnen. Net als specifieke hulpverlening, opvang voor LHBT-personen bijvoorbeeld. Dat is echt een topic die, weet je, dat mensen zeggen van ja, je hebt de leger des heils en noem maar op. Ik zeg niet dat de reguliere opvang hun werk niet goed doet, begrijp me niet verkeerd. Maar het kan beter door een specifieke safe space te openen waar... Ja, want transgenders en zo, die gaan, je noem maar op, ik weet niet of je het ook hebt. Ik heb het in mijn vriendenkring en mijn kennissen, dat ze geen veilige thuishaven hebben. Je weet zelf hoe zwaar een transitie is. Je gaat bij allerlei mannen slapen met allerlei gevolgen van dien, weet je. Ja. Het is gewoon de realiteit op dit moment. En dat zijn wel onderwerpen waar ik denk, daar moeten we wel bij stilstaan. Transgenders die geen werk vinden, weet je, dat zijn onderwerpen.
Dus daar moet vanuit Pride echt ook meer aandacht voor zijn.
Zeker, zeker.
Ja. Hoe gaan we dat bereiken? Door dit soort talks of door...
Onder andere, het start met bewustwording, communicatie en inderdaad met elkaar. En samen met organisaties en de mensen waar het om gaat doen.
Dus gesprek, dat vind je belangrijk.
Zeker.
Nice, oké. Thanks.
Heel
erg bedankt. Ik denk dat ik hem... over ga gooien naar het publiek. Ik zie Dylan daar staan met een microfoon. Dus mensen die een vraag hebben of een opmerking, iets bij willen dragen, die kunnen hun hand opsteken en dan komt Dylan naar je toe. En ik dacht misschien dat het leuk was om de laatste vraag die ik net aan Beyong stelde, om die ook bij jullie neer te leggen. Dus als we nadenken over Pride, waar we nu staan en waar we over 20, 30, 50 jaar staan. Hoe zien we dat voor ons? Wat moet er veranderen? Wat kan er beter? Wat moet er blijven? Zijn er mensen die daar gedachten over hebben? Nee. Helemaal niemand? Nee? Misschien andere gedachten over de video? Vragen aan Beyong mag ook. Vragen aan mij mag zelfs. Ik zie daar iemand helemaal achterin.
I think if we could change one thing about Pride, it could be to include the people that are not normally inclined to go there and to inform themselves. For example, when I mentioned Pride once to my dad, he was like, ew, leather suits, men in their underwear. And I think we could do more to find those people and reach out to them if they're not going to reach out to us.
Right. And how do you think we can achieve that?
I think that would come down to informing and educating people again. And not only focusing on the party, but focusing on the serious talks that we need to have.
Right. So relaying the focus from the party maybe to the protest, or the important conversations that we need to have.
Yeah, maybe not necessarily the protests indeed, but just sitting people down and saying like, hey, I have something to say, I'd like you to listen.
Interesting. Zijn er mensen die echt zeggen, nee, Pride, dat gaat nu helemaal de verkeerde kant op. Dat feestje, we moeten veel radicaler nadenken over hoe we Pride inzetten als een protest, als een mogelijkheid om onderwerpen op de agenda te zetten. Zijn er mensen die zich helemaal niet verbonden voelen met wat Pride nu vaak is? Daar helemaal achterin.
Hi. I thought we might just speak English for the English-speaking people here, but I think Pride should just be more than what it is right now, so that like we can all feel connected to Pride like the whole year, like you said, and also that it's in schools with really young people, so not just dads who don't know anything about Pride, but also like young kids in schools who don't know anything, so that it can be like, we don't just have to redo the work from older generations, but we can start with young people now and have Pride be all year and for all ages, and that it's a thing in education and not just a protest or a party.
Right, so bring Pride from the streets into the schools.
Yeah.
Right. I think that's a marvelous idea. Here in the front. Maybe, shall we switch to English? Is that better for everyone? Oh yeah, I see a lot of nods. Okay, we're gonna switch to English then. So I'm sorry that the talk was in Dutch then. So sorry.
So I think it's not either or. I think it's good to celebrate diversity, and I think it's good to have a moment of party and celebration. But I think that today they focus too much on the celebration. It seems that there's nothing we need to claim. There's nothing to protest about. That everything is already good. And that's really not the case. So I think very often we are really giving the wrong message, as if in the Netherlands everything is perfect for minorities, when that's really the wrong message we're giving.
Do you think that also has to do something with the fact that Pride is more and more enjoyed by people who aren't part of the LGBTQIA movement or community? Yeah. So for them it's just a fun party, and for other people it's actually about celebrating, being proud of who they are, because in their daily lives they can't?
Yeah, that's one of the points. So often it's seen as a mainstream celebration when the focus is lost. What are we really saying? Why are we really here? Yeah.
Is there also, the mainstreaming of Pride, that's how you're describing it, are there also advantages of that?
Definitely, yeah.
So what are those, you think?
So I think that the advantage is what she was describing. How do we get her dad to see this? So I think that's really good. So the marketing behind it is really awesome. So people know it and they think it's fun and they come. However, once we get her father there, what do we want to tell her father? Not just, oh, this is just a bunch of people dancing and having fun, because there's much more. There's a whole struggle that these people went through, and then her father doesn't get to listen to that story. He thinks, oh, these people are already fine, they are having like awesome life, and everything is perfect, when obviously we have really good things, but there are so many battles still to fight. And if we don't look at that, we lose the focus.
So it's about bringing a multitude of stories within that mainstream, narrative, basically, and showing more within that space. Are there any ideas of how we can do that? So combining the mainstream with the radical. And again, silence. Oh, no, wait, there's someone in the back.
I just love making him walk.
What was that?
I just love making him walk.
Yeah, we love to see him walk.
Well, Pride, it's more than 1 week, but usually if it's celebrated in a city, it is 1 week or a little bit more or less, and it is mostly focused on, well, it's different because I think Rotterdam Pride has a very different, at least this year, agenda than Amsterdam Pride. Amsterdam Pride is really more of the party, and this time I think Rotterdam Pride has very educational topics, and also because of Corona, but you know, this is different. I think Pride should be an all year around, like just the word Pride and what that means. The first time I went to Pride, I cried because I felt validated, I felt seen, and I felt like I belonged there. And I think people that go to the mainstream parties, they don't understand that. And people that come to the educational stuff, they already feel connected in a way. I don't have a solution, but I did want to say that. And I hope we can find a way to change that.
No, but I think you're saying some very interesting things, like feeling seen within a space of an event, and how healing that can be. The only thing that I think the video talked about so profoundly was how certain people were not feeling seen by Pride. And I think I'm just questioning, like, how can we remedy for that? How can we make sure that Pride is someone or is, you know, an event which everyone can feel seen, everyone can feel what you felt that moment in time?
I think that's very hard because we're such a huge group and everyone's so different. And even people that have certain struggles in this community don't know the struggles of the other people in the community. I think if you have like a big party, it is almost impossible to include everyone. You should either maybe divide it, have stuff on different days, include more people in a certain part, or like switch it up a bit, because it is impossible to include such a huge, diverse group.
Right, because why is that, do you think?
Because we have a huge acronym. And every letter stands for someone else, and every story is completely different. And then we're not even talking about race or ethnicity or anything like that. Just if you're, and because it's even broader than that, but if you're only talking about gender or sexuality, which again, two hugely different things, they all combine in so many different ways, it is impossible to include everyone.
Right, so it's trying to have an homogeneous party or event for a non-homogeneous group.
Exactly.
That's what you're saying. Cool, thank you. Is there anything you would like to add? I'm seeing you.
No. I'm just listening and I find it interesting.
Any other thoughts? Maybe also on the video specifically. Oh, I'm seeing a hand.
Hi, sorry, I just wanted to reply because I think it's not impossible to find the people that feel excluded to Pride. I think they're there. I think they just didn't get a seat at the table. And I think that's particularly what happened with Rotterdam Pride, which resulted in a lot of different, well, it wasn't actually a response to Rotterdam Pride having different groups like Queer Rotterdam. But I think they should be spoken to. I think there was a huge group of activists last year at Rotterdam Pride who did not get to speak to the organization of Rotterdam Pride. I think a result of those activists, even though they didn't get to have that conversation, is the reason why there's such a diverse and insightful program this year. So I think maybe we should just listen.
Listen to the people who are actively speaking out and criticizing the mainstream event, you mean?
Yeah, exactly. Because I think they're there, and I think they have a voice. Listening is then a very simple act.
Yeah, I think that's really hits the nail right on the head. It's true. I'm seeing a hand over there. Over there. Yes.
Hello.
Hi.
So I just wanted to add to what was said lastly. I completely agree that you should actually decentralize the events from top management, let's say. So, because you already have so many beautiful spokespeople in this group, why should there be a whole management? Why should there be capitalism behind it? Why should all of this be a part of this organization when you already have strong people behind it who are in it with their whole history, their whole future depending on it? This is what I would love to see for the next 30 years as a cis woman. I would love to see that every single person has a seat on a table, every single person is heard, and not the people that have the money, but the people who are living it, the people that have the struggle. Because it's so hard to see friends struggling and to feel identified.
I think it's really interesting what you're saying. So instead of having an organization sort of top-down deciding who gets the mic and who doesn't, sort of having multiple mics being passed around by the community itself. Is that kind of what you're proposing?
Yes, because at the end of the day, the Netherlands were a small country. Rotterdam is a small city. I only moved here a year ago, and I lived in Paris, where the community is so small. After a while, you recognize everybody. And I truly believe that the community of Rotterdam can come together without having the big ups, having a say in everything, and having to pass the budget, because we know the money is there, we know the will is there. We just maybe don't have the right people there who understand what is actually a priority. And it's not maybe the party, the big opening night or the ending night, it's perhaps the talks like we have today. Because for me, there is a hunger to know more, there is a hunger to learn, there's a hunger to understand and relate. And that could be for many people.
A hunger to really engage with the message of pride, and not with the buzzword that people use it for. Because you're also referring to this commercialization of pride, this involvement of big companies paying big dollar to organize big parties, who are kind of using it, you know, in sort of like a pinkwashing sense. So
they
using
all wake up. They all wake up around Pride Week and they're like, oh, let's put the flag out, and then the rest of the year they are like quiet, like, what the fuck, what happened?
Right.
We're still here. Why 1 week? We're here every day of the year.
So should we like ban companies from Pride?
No, not ban, but like what happened with the BLM movement, companies were held responsible for actions. People found their voice to speak against companies because there was such a huge support. And it was the beautiful thing of the movement. Everybody in the community came together. Everybody in a movement came together. And this again can happen for this, as has happened when Marsha P. Johnson started the movement. We need to have a new uprising, let's say, where we don't end up in the same situation 30 years from now, where we're still having this conversation. Why are trans people being murdered? Why are they being hunted down the streets in the United States, South Africa, in the Netherlands? Why is it still happening? I don't want to have that conversation anymore in 30 years.
Right. Thank you. Yeah. What a wonderful array of thoughts you're offering. Thank you. There is one thing that I actually also kind of want to address still, because I think it's also very present in the video of Alok and Olave, racism within the LGBTQI community, and maybe specifically within Pride, mainstream Pride organizations. How do we deal with this huge problem within the LGBTQIA plus community, do you think?
I think we must all start by ourselves, because I think we are all human en we doen het allemaal bewust, onbewust. Sorry, dit doe ik even in Nederlands.
You can do it in Dutch if you like.
En onbewust en bewust doen we eraan mee, want het gebeurt ook overal over de wereld. En ja, hier in Nederland is het er helaas ook nog. En soms moet je ook de olifant in de kamer aanspreken, weet je, om het ongemakkelijke gesprek te gaan. En ik denk dat we daar in het begin zijn van met de hele Black Lives Matter en die George Floyd discussie, zeg maar. Dat was wel echt een moment dat ik realiseerde, ja, we kunnen er niet meer omheen. En nu moet je ook het beestje bij het naampje noemen, om het zo te zeggen. En ja, op allerlei manieren ervaar je het. Ik bedoel, ik ben transvrouw van kleur en ja, in een Europa waar je 3 keer zo hard moet werken als jij bijvoorbeeld ergens binnen zou komen, om het zo even plat te zeggen. Weet je, als jij binnen zou komen, weet je, die blank is, blauwe ogen heeft. Het is gewoon hoe de maatschappij eenmaal in elkaar zit en het is nogmaals onbewust en bewust doen we er allemaal aan mee.
Ja, precies.
Dus ik denk dat we allemaal bij onszelf moeten ook nagaan, wat is racisme en wanneer ben ik racistisch of wanneer doe ik een racistische uitspraak, weet je. En daarom blijf ik ook altijd zeggen one love and be you, want ja.
Ja, precies. Maar zeg maar, ik kan me voorstellen hoe ingewikkeld dit soort gesprekken kunnen zijn.
Zeker.
Waar loop je tegenaan op zo'n moment?
Ja, gewoon dingen benoemen ook. Hoe je het benoemt en nogmaals, wat is racisme? Weet je, want ik kan zeggen, ja, wanneer ben je racistisch bezig? Wanneer ben je een racist? Weet je, en ook ja, discriminatie. Hoe zie je dat, weet je? En ja, je merkt het aan hoe mensen doen. En soms heb je geen woorden nodig.
Any other thoughts on racism within the LGBTQI community? Maybe how we can try to open up that conversation, because that's what you're kind of describing, is that often the conversation closes off because specifically white people are bad at having those conversations. The white fragility, right? And I'm speaking as a white person, of course.
Het is soms echt awkward en ongemakkelijk, weet je. Want dan denk ik, hoor ik het goed of weet je. En ik ben wel eens ook de enigste persoon van kleur in een kamer geweest. En weet je, ja, soms krijg je gewoon dan die awareness. Omdat je different bent of anders, om het zo even te zeggen, weet je. Of, ja.
So it's also, if you're the only person in a room, dan is het moeilijk om dat gesprek aan te gaan in je eentje.
Helemaal, ja.
Ik kan me voorstellen. Ik zie daar een hand. I'm seeing somebody raising their hand.
I'm trying to do it in English, and I wanted to say something for what you were asking. Well, I don't say I don't make mistakes, but I do think it's not only for black or brown people to have this conversation with people. It's for all of us. If we want to educate the rest of the Netherlands or the world or something like that about the LGBT community, we have to do it with ourselves. I think the whole community is always changing, because first there were only 4 letters and now there are a lot of more. So we are educating ourselves about that. So why don't we do that about the rest too? It's not only for the black and brown people to tell other people to do better or to educate, but also for white people.
Or also for us.
Yes.
Right. Yes. So how do you personally try to do that, for instance?
Crying, mostly. I did start with my own family, and well, that's a lot of crying for my mom, but I'm trying, and it's a lot of conversations. But I do it in my work too, and well, I said I do make a lot of mistakes, I think, but it's just trying to have a conversation with other people and not trying to be mad about it when they are doing it wrong.
Right, thank you. Any other thoughts? I'm also seeing that this is probably the time to stop. So maybe one more question?
I have a question.
Oh, what? Wait.
Ik heb een vraag.
Oh, Dylan, you have a
vraag.
question yourself. Oh, that's what I didn't understand.
I think what I see that it's extremely dangerous that we're in a marginalized group, and certain people in this marginalized group have found safety in the last 50 years because of the movement. And I think it's extremely dangerous to, within a marginalized group, outcast people, and I think that's what happens a lot. And I'm as being more femme, I really saw that growing up, being like, I'm in this community, but nobody actually sees me for who I am, because it's either I'm fetishized or I'm. So I think that's really something we should take away, that it's so dangerous to, within our own community, to within that community start putting each other apart. I think that's the core of the problem.
Right.
Yeah.
Right, so the marginalization that's happening within an already marginalized community, that's what you're talking about, right?
Yeah, I think that's really dangerous.
That's toxic.
Yes.
Right. Yeah, but how do we, again, how do we prevent that from happening? We should be aware of this, but we should also take action on this, I think.
Yes, I think more talks like this, more places like this, that you create a safe space that people can speak their mind, and if you want to see it brown, white, or how you want to see it, get them together, and we moeten elkaar ergens gaan vinden, weet je. En ja, I think talks are a middle om elkaar daarin tegen te komen, en knowing about history vooral.
So meeting each other, having conversations that might be hard is important, but how important is it also to be able to, and I think this also is something that they talk about in the video, to, take yourself out of that conversation sometimes and retreat into a safe space where you don't have to deal with those, injustices, those oppressions, those,
True. Yeah, that's what I also recognize, with Alok. I have a friend, and she can tell me everything. With her, I can tell myself, and also my niece, and people I can die, weet je, uitlaatklep, en ja, het is wel belangrijk.
Right, because I think that's also, I lost my train of thought. I think we're actually ready to call it a day for today. Are there any last things that people want to add, discuss, ask, talk about? We have time for one more question, I think, or one more contribution. Over there. Oh, yeah, in the front.
I was just thinking that, especially around white people, I think even if you're a white woman and you've experienced oppression under the patriarchy, just because you've experienced oppression doesn't mean that you're somehow incapable of causing oppression yourself. So I think it's connecting those dots, and just because you've experienced one doesn't mean you can't be complicit with another, and to connect those dots somehow.
And I think this is something you see a lot within the LGBT community also, and specifically within, for instance, white gay male spaces, where a lot of them are actually but I'm gay, I'm oppressed too. I'm not the oppressor in this picture, and spoiler alert, you actually are, Yeah. So how do we bring people the awareness that this is actually also part of their specific position?
I think it has to be an ongoing conversation, because I think somehow we are understanding of one when it happens to us, but we don't want to be understanding of another when it isn't our own. So I think you have to create environments where people feel that they can speak about these things. And I think something like this is really, really good for that.
But how do we approach these people who are taking on this role of the oppressor? So how do we approach them? Do we approach them, you know, with anger? Do we approach them with words? Do we approach them with compassion and kindness? Like what, maybe it's not either one, but maybe it's all three and more? Like how do we have these hard conversations?
I think like what Alok said in the video, like they are so radically kind and compassionate. Like they talked a lot about on their Instagram recently about like replying to haters and things like that. And just having that kindness is like something insane. I think something that a lot of us can inspire to have ourselves, to have that conversation with people who, yeah, they piss us off, but you know, we want to have that conversation, because if you're angry with people, then you just alienate them.
Super interesting. You know, that empathy and kindness, I think, is going to be the ultimate part of the solution, but we have to be mindful, I think, also of how exhausting that can be and how taxing and how violent that can feel also, because you need to empathize with people who are hating on you or are putting their bullshit on you, basically. So you know, how do you navigate these things? I think that's super hard. And I think Olave and Alok give a real great way of navigating these different positions that you can hold within this debate. How about that for an ending, guys? Beyong, I really want to thank you for a lovely conversation. Bedankt voor het superleuke gesprek.
Graag gedaan. Jij ook bedankt.
Dank jullie wel allemaal voor het komen en het kijken en het meepraten.